Welcome, everyone. Super excited to have Chloe here with us, visiting us virtually in our series of lectures. As you know, AR and VR and lighting, lighting is really important for AR and VR. Chloe is talking about all of her fantastic work on relighting today. Chloe is currently a senior research scientist at Netflix, working on the intersection of graphics, machine learning, and filmmaking, as you probably guessed from the, for the affiliation. She previously worked at Google Research, doing really cool, applications related to ARCore and photos and so on, working on relighting as well. She got her PhD from USC. Before that, she worked at L'Oreal and was responsible on makeup try-on applications and AR-related software. I believe it was called Makeup Genius. It was really cool and way ahead of the time. Afterwards, I feel like all the companies did it. Thank you for coming, Chloe. Please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Ira, for the intro. Let me just share my screen. Again, thank you for the intro. Thank you to Ira and for John for the invitation. I'm really happy to present today. I would have loved to be there in person, but obviously equally happy to be here presenting today over Zoom. And thank you, a few brave souls, for showing your faces. So as Ira mentioned, in terms of affiliation, I very recently joined a new computer graphics research team at Netflix. I started just a few months ago. Our team is exploring research at the intersection of filmmaking and machine learning, and we're focused on virtual production, visual effects, as well as animation. And so I just want to do a quick plug before we begin that we are hiring both for full-time research scientist positions, which would be like graduating PhD students, and we're also looking for interns, which would typically be either MS or PhD students who are still planning to go back and complete more of their coursework or research. So today, the topic of my talk is going to be relighting portraits using machine learning. And here the goal is to be able to realistically change the lighting in a portrait image after capture. And essentially, this is going to mean that a photographer no longer needs to worry about a scene's lighting environment, and instead they can kind of change it later in post, unlocking all kinds of new artistic or creative opportunities. As I said, I did join Netflix somewhat recently, so everything that I'm going to present today was work that I completed as part of my time at Google Research. And I had lots of collaborators for the research that I'm presenting today. I'm going to thank them all at the end in one slide, and I hope that I have everyone's name and I didn't leave everyone out. So we're all familiar with portrait photography, where getting the lighting just right at capture time has really been essential to forming a compelling shot. Now, of course, when we look at a portrait, we care about the composition, we care about the colors in the scene, but the lighting that's used in a particular image can really change its mood and its feel. And so in the talk today, I'm going to discuss two techniques for changing the lighting in a portrait after capture, which is something that wasn't really possible before the recent era of machine learning being applied to computer graphics problems. Now, in the first part of the talk, I'm going to cover a project I had the opportunity to work on at Google called Portrait Light. Here you can see Portrait Light that's running in the Google Photos app, and it's being applied here on a photograph after capture. The app user here is basically positioning a virtual light source in the scene, and you can see the light source kind of rotating around the subject's face, changing the lighting on her face. Now, the data sets that we captured for this project, as well as the research that we completed for this Portrait Light product, did help to pave the way towards the second project that I'll highlight in the talk, which is our SIGGRAPH 2021 paper that was called Total Relighting, Learning to Relight Portraits for Background Replacement. So unlike in Portrait Light, where the idea was really to add in kind of subtle directional lighting into the scene, with Total Relighting, our goal was really to completely change the portrait's illumination after capture. And that means that we may want to change the color, the intensity, and the directionality of the portrait's lighting, pretending that we photographed the subject in an entirely new world, or because this is the Reality Lab, we could also just pretend that we captured them in a completely different place altogether, a different real world place, a virtual world of our creation. But I'll start first with Portrait Light. And the inspiration behind Portrait Light was how professional portrait photographers use what's called off-camera light sources, whether in a studio, like in the example that you can see here, or adding further lights into non-studio scenes. For instance, you could bring one of these lights with you into an outdoor scene if you wanted to photograph a subject in the shade, for instance. Now, in this studio setup, we're looking at what's called the key light here, and this is on the left. And this is lighting the left side image of the subject's face here. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse, so hopefully you can. I'm gonna go back, yeah. And so in this example, we've got the key light, which is lighting the left side of her face. We also have a second light source that's called the fill light, which is kind of filling in the light source on the other side of her face. I guess it's image left, not her left side of her face. And then finally, we have a third light source, which is a backlight. And the idea here is that we're going to kind of provide additional contrast to be able to change the appearance between, you know, the back part of the image and the portrait to kind of just add that pop behind the person. Now, in this image, you actually don't see a ton of the effect of the backlight. We would sometimes even move this further behind the subject and might be called a rim light in that case. And you would actually see subtle outlines of the hair fibers that would be kind of back illuminated by this light. So we could place it behind the subject for an even more dramatic effect. So portrait is essentially inspired by these very heavy, expensive off-camera light sources, which are really only available to professionals. And so we wanted to see if we could build an algorithmic equivalent into every smartphone where you could capture an image anywhere out in the world and then add photogenic lighting into the portrait after capture. So for the portrait light feature, we've got two different modes. The first is an automatic mode where we're adding a virtual key light into the scene, and that's based on the subject's inferred head pose as well as the estimated scene lighting. And those basically, that off-camera light source would be automatically positioned and the intensity varied based on, you know, we can change the angle of the light that's added into the scene in order to complement the lighting of the existing photograph. And in the second mode, which is the user-guided mode, and this is the part that's running inside the Google Photos app, you can go in and modify this light source and kind of reposition it to your liking after the effect. And here's what two of the different features looked like. On the left is very subtle. It's the automatic one. You can see that the image left part, which is the subject's right, the image left part of the subject's face is being subtly brightened. This is a GIF showing before and after. And then on the right is the same animation we saw earlier where a user of the app is adjusting the lighting location, and you can see the kind of rendering change. So both the automatic and the user-guided portrait light modes required several different machine learning components, which I will talk about today. For the first part, and this is for the automatic light placement, so like deciding where do you actually put the directional light into the scene. We talked to professional photographers on our team who indicated that they would place off-camera lights for studio portraiture first based on the subject's head pose. And to see an example of this in action, here I'm showing a few different studio lighting setups on the right, where you can see that the position of the lighting that's used in the studio varies in order to create the desired lighting effect. And this varies as a function of the head pose of the model, which you can see here for a few different head poses. Here we're looking at kind of overhead shots of where would you position the light relative to the person and the camera, and then what would be the final effect that you would get. Now, our photographers said that they would also add in off-camera light sources into a scene based on the color and the directionality of the natural scene lighting. For instance, to target a specific contrast ratio, they might want to fill in a certain region of the face that's detected as brighter or darker in the original image. Contrast ratio is kind of the ratio of the level of the light on the brightest lit areas in the photograph compared with the light in the least lit or the dimmest part of the photograph. And so for an automatically placed key light, we wanted kind of digital analogs to these two perceptual cues. So the head pose and then the scene lighting that would help the photographer figure out where would you actually add in a fill light or a key light rather into the scene. We also, of course, wanted a way to add the synthetic key light into the scene. So we need kind of a rendering like step. So even if we know, okay, here's the ideal location where a photographer would add in a light into the scene, how do you actually change the portrait photograph to make it look like that additional light has been added when it wasn't really there in the first place? And so for this, we need kind of a synthetic key light portrait renderer. So for the head pose detection, there's already quite an extensive body of research in this field, and it's often used for AR filters, for visual effects, for instance. And as Ira mentioned, I worked on AR cosmetics applications before, so we were using things like this way back in the day. In our case, for this project, we used Google's media pipe head pose detector, as well as facial key point detector, which you can see running in this image here on the slide. And so that part, it does involve machine learning. There's extensive labeled data sets that go into creating this, but we didn't have to do this from scratch for this project ourselves. However, there's very limited prior work in estimating scene lighting from a portrait. And there's even less prior work on synthetically adding illumination into a portrait image after capture. So these are kind of the two parts that we had to create from scratch for this project. I'll start first by describing the scene lighting estimation technique, because this was kind of my main contribution to the project, but then I'll touch a little bit towards the end on the rendering part as well. When we look at a portrait, as in this example here, we might describe our subject as being lit from one side here with a bright yellow light, and from the other side with a bright green light. But the light falling on the subject, kind of creating her appearance in the scene, comes not from just one or two bright individual light sources, but rather from a full sphere of lighting directions around her, which is like all 360 degrees. Now, in this case, the lighting environment can be represented as a 360 panorama, which many of you on the call are probably familiar with. Now, of course, the dominant light sources in this scene are the bright green and the bright yellow lights, and you do see those in the panorama here. But even the yellow light that's bounced from those light sources off the sidewalk and then finally reflecting towards her face, those are contributing towards her overall appearance. So we can often look at these lighting environments like this as panoramas, but in visual effects, we might also look at them as images of mirror balls. You can see that in the second from the left here. Now, and this of course is because a mirror ball does reflect the full 360 spheres, 360 degrees of lighting directions, and that's because it's a sphere. Now, in fact, at SIGGRAPH in 1998, Paul Dubovik, who I've enjoyed working with now at Netflix, previously at Google, and also before at university, introduced a lighting measurement technique of photographing a mirror ball to record a scene's lighting in the real world. And in practice, this actually required multiple exposure photography and then subsequent radiometric alignment of the different shots. And these multiple exposures are required because lighting in the real world is high dynamic range. And that's to say that light sources can be orders of magnitude brighter than the rest of the scene. And so you can't capture their full intensity at a single exposure. So if we go back to our portrait, assuming this is all we have as an input, we're essentially trying to figure out, can we treat the face as a lighting measurement instrument to recover the intensity and the directionality of a scene's illumination from only a single low dynamic range portrait, so just one exposure. Now, of course, this does have applicability to our portrait light project, which is what I kind of used to introduce it, but there's other applications as well, particularly in AR and in visual effects. Like you might want to render in objects into the portrait, for instance, that aren't there in the real world. And for that, you need to know the illumination so that you can accurately match the rendered objects with the original portrait for a seamless composite. Now, this part of the project was published at SIGGRAPH Asia in 2020 as kind of like a short paper, technical communications. So just wanted to mention that there. We thought that our effort kind of to try to go from portraits to 360 lighting wasn't entirely hopeless because similar to spheres, faces have a diversity of surface normals and they also reflect light somewhat predictably. However, there's still an inherently difficult problem here because there's ambiguity in the scale of the illumination depending on the subject's skin tone. It's fundamentally very difficult to estimate lighting from a photograph of a subject who has an unknown skin tone because radiance is the product of both lighting and reflectance. However, the model that we trained for this project does allow us to predict the color and the intensity of illumination from all directions for a given portrait, and it yields higher frequency lighting than previous approaches. The predicted lighting that we got from our network here, we can use it as input for our portrait light auto light placement module without adjusting the scale of the illumination. So it kind of works on a diversity of different images that we would want the model to work for. So to train the model in a supervised manner, we needed to have portraits that are labeled with their ground truth illumination. And you can see a few examples of these here. So the ground truth lighting here I'm showing as insets in the upper right corner of each one of the images. And I'm showing this kind of reflected off of 3 different spheres that have different reflectivities to help us visualize the full dynamic range of the lighting And this is common practice kind of within rendering and computer graphics to show lighting like reflected off of these spheres. And as you saw a version of that a few slides earlier for that yellow and green environment. Now to generate this kind of data set, we leveraged a technique introduced at SIGGRAPH in 2000 called image-based relighting. And the idea here is that we can photograph a subject as they're illuminated by a set of lighting directions that form a basis on a sphere. Then we can scale and linearly combine these basis images to produce the appearance of the subject in any lighting environment. And so this essentially gets us to a portrait with its ground truth illumination. But for our model to be able to generalize, we need to have photographs of these, subjects lit from the spherical basis of many different people. And so what we've done at Google is that we first acquired images of 70 diverse individuals, and you can see them here. Here, they're all illuminated with the sort of same flat lighting environment under an even sphere of white light. We've asked each of them to perform a diverse set of different facial expressions, to wear different accessories like hats and scarves and bandanas for better model generalization. This data set was actually captured before COVID, so nobody was wearing masks, but that was, I think, an oversight that we could not have possibly envisioned at the time. We photographed these reflectance basis images inside the light stage system at Google. And this is a computational lighting system that has a lot of different camera viewpoints, many different lighting directions, and it enables us to capture these kind of reflectance basis images for lots of different camera views of the same individual. You can see kind of 6 of these different camera views that are more of the portrait ones here, although we also have some full body shots as well, which I'll show later. So here's an example of the set of photographs for one subject. And this is actually 24 out of the 331 lighting directions that we capture. And so we're kind of half the way there at this point. We can use image-based relighting to generate training data, which would be like the appearance of subjects in lots of different lighting environments. But in order to do this, we also need to have lots of different lighting environments to use to create this data set. So we leveraged a rapid lighting capture technique that we introduced in some earlier work to capture on the order of about 1 million high dynamic range lighting environments with paired high resolution backgrounds. And this was kind of in both indoor as well as outdoor scenes. It was mostly around Google offices in Northern and Southern California. You can see a few different kinds of examples here. And this is, again, I'm showing those 3 spheres that have different reflectivities, which are reflecting the lighting environment. It's like a mirror ball, a diffuse gray ball, and a matte silver ball that sort of splits the difference. With these captures, again, I said that we also had high resolution background imagery. So in addition to relighting our subjects using the image-based relighting technique that I mentioned earlier, for our frontal camera views, we also illuminated a gray board that was placed behind the subject at capture time in order to acquire images that we needed to compute a robust alpha channel, like you can see here. And then for remaining views, so non-kind of frontal views inside the light stage system, we just used a foreground background segmentation model. Then with our high resolution backgrounds that we acquired along with our lighting environments, via compositing, we're able to form training images for this model that mostly appear as in the wild portraits that are paired with their ground truth illumination. And here's a few more examples of the kind of training data that we generated. You can see the lighting kind of ground truth spheres inset in the upper right-hand corners. There might even be some familiar faces here from the computer graphics research community if you look closely. So there's like a little Easter egg there. During both training and inference, we crop the portraits to the face region using a standard face detector. One of the questions that I often get when I'm talking about this work is, well, in addition to using a face detector to sort of get approximately, the face sort of positioned in the right place, what about actually using facial key points or using something about the facial geometry to try to improve the lighting estimation? And we actually did not do this here in this work. And I think that would be an excellent thing to do moving forward, because since this work has been published, there's been several efforts to kind of normalize an image in order to frontalize it or to, change it so that you actually have an understanding of, which pixels on the face correspond to which parts of a canonical face mesh, for instance, or things like that. So that's kind of an open thing that we could do as next work. So with this data set, we're able to train an encoder-decoder style convolutional neural network by minimizing a multi-scale rendering loss for our 3 different reflective spheres that we've seen pop up on previous slides, as well as a multi-scale adversarial loss to ensure that we get high frequency illumination as a result. So the output of the network is actually like a very, very small 32 by 32 pixel tiny image of a high dynamic range mirror sphere. And then that can be used to render out objects of different materials. In an AR setting, you might want to place those, rendered objects into the scene with your portrait. In our portrait light model, we basically just take that tiny sphere and pass it as an input into our auto light placement module. The full paper for this project has a lot of different qualitative and quantitative comparisons against previous methods for lighting estimation from faces, but I'm going to skip most of them in favor of sort of the more visually compelling results. So in this slide, I'm estimating the lighting off of these input portraits, and you can see like the input and then the estimation here. And then I'm using this lighting that's been estimated to light a subject who we'd previously captured in the light stage, who was unseen in training data. And obviously the input was unseen in training as well. And so this is a completely different subject who's lit with the estimated lighting. Now, because we had light stage captures of these people, we can also compare this directly with the ground truth. And so what we've done here is that our model is recovering illumination of a similar scale across subjects. And so we're able to take the lighting measured off of one subject with a completely different skin tone, light a different subject altogether without making any adjustments to the scale of the illumination. And so to the best of our knowledge, our kind of inverse lighting from faces approach here is the first that we've both kind of trained and evaluated across subjects with different skin tones. The model here also generalizes well to real world images. And of course, I'm showing this on subjects that we did capture in the light stage, even though they were not in our training set. And we do need this model to generalize because we're trying to use it for the portrait light feature I introduced earlier. So here are a few different in the wild portraits. And then here are renderings that are based on the illumination that's estimated to the right of each portrait. And although we don't have the ground truth lighting that corresponds to these portraits because these were captured out in the wild, you can kind of observe that the general directionality, intensity, and the color of the predicted illumination is plausible. And it's similar to what a photographer might suppose was the lighting in the scene when just looking at it by eye, which is really what we're trying to achieve in order to use this as a cue for the auto light placement heuristic. We're even able to estimate plausible lighting in this case for this subject in the upper left corner who's wearing a fun Halloween costume. And she's hiding very well, but this is actually one of the paper co-authors here in this costume. Her name is Jay Bush. And you'll actually see her on the next slide too. Our model is not explicitly trained for temporal consistency, but here what I'm doing is I'm estimating per frame illumination from Jay's face. She's got no costume this time. And then given those lighting estimates that come just from like the crop of her face from each one of these frames, I'm able to render out a sphere or spheres in the upper right corner using the lighting. And then we can compare it with the Christmas ornament that Jay is holding, which has the same material or the same BRDF as the uppermost sphere on the slide. And so you can see this kind of being used more in an AR setting, and it is working at video rate here. And although we intended to use this to aid in portrait relighting, there's sort of broader applications for face-based lighting estimation more generally. And so we've kind of enabled new applications in post-production visual effects. So here's an example where I've got a digital double actor replacement that I'll show. So this is an in the wild portrait, and then I've estimated the illumination from her face. And then I have a digital double of an actor, and then I can light that actor and composite them into the original photograph with consistent illumination. So the idea is that even though this is a CG character, it should basically match the lighting on the scene. And this is perhaps more applicable to my current work at Netflix, where you might not have time on set to go and capture your high dynamic range lighting environment at every single shot. So you could, in theory, just take the plate of an actor performing on set and use that as a record of the scene's illumination. So now we've kind of seen the ML lighting estimation module that was in Portrait Light. And I said earlier, I would touch very briefly on the ML kind of relighting or rendering engine. And the core idea behind this is that our light stage data set that we used for the lighting estimation module with the kind of reflectance basis images, this can be used to help us estimate geometry from each portrait in the form of surface normals, which you can see here on this kind of colorized image on the left. And this is one of our light stage subjects, but we're eventually going to try to do this for in the wild photos as well. The other thing that we get with this light stage data set is we have the ability to create images of subjects with and without that added key light that we were talking about adding into the scene. And so that kind of gets us a ground truth data set for what would a subject look like with this key light and what would they look like without. And that gets us the training pairs that we need in order to train the rendering engine in a supervised manner. So for the relighting module, the way it works is that we take an input portrait and then we first estimate the surface geometry from the portrait in the form of normals. And then we supply our target lighting direction that we've basically come up with by incorporating the head pose in the lighting estimation. We take this target lighting direction and we take the dot product of that lighting direction with the surface normals to create what's called a light visibility image. You can see that here in the middle of the slide. Now, for those of you who are interested in rendering, I just want to note that this dot product is equivalent to creating a Lambertian or a diffuse rendering of the subject based on the estimation of their geometry. We then train another network that takes as input this light visibility image as well as the original portrait. And we then predict what's called a quotient image. And this is a per pixel multiplier that essentially produces this relit result that we're looking for. Now, the normals network can be supervised directly based on the ground truth geometry that comes from the light stage captures. And then the quotient image network can be supervised on ground truth relit portraits that are basically with and without that synthetic key light that we can synthesize using image-based relighting from the light stage scans. Now, although we're happy that we were able to launch this kind of ML-based feature into both the Google Pixel and Google Photos, with the world kind of turning more to video conferencing, as in our call today, we wanted to be able to move kind of beyond these more subtle lighting enhancements to tackle complete relighting with background replacement, especially because background replacement on Zoom and Google Meet was really taking off. And so our team pivoted to work on a more generic relighting in the second project that I'll discuss, which is our project called Total Relighting, Learning to Relight Portraits for Background Replacement. And this appeared at SIGGRAPH in 2021. And the main idea here is that we want to be able to go again from an arbitrary in the wild portrait to a relit portrait for a realistic background replacement using machine learning techniques. And if we look more specifically at the problem statement, we're going to start out with our input portrait. We're going to assume that it's just a tone mapped RGB portrait. We don't expect any depth annotation of any sort or geometry annotation. We don't expect to have multiple exposure photography here. And then we're also going to assume that we're given a high resolution, high dynamic range panoramic lighting environment, which will essentially serve both as the target illumination for the portrait as well as the background. And the idea here is that you can extract a view into this panorama that has kind of matches the target field of view that you're looking for, assuming that the panorama is sufficiently high res. And so from these inputs, we then wanted to be able to relight the subject and composite them into this view extracted from the panorama with consistent illumination, like you can see on the example slide here. And I know I showed this slide earlier when I was introducing the idea of, omnidirectional lighting environments for lighting a subject. And I said, oh, she's lit with, yellow light from the left and green light from the right, or at least in the image space. And in actuality, she was not actually in this environment. So this was actually a CG rendered result from this project. So teaser earlier. So before we describe the approach, I wanted to highlight kind of where we were as the state of the art before this paper. And this was joint work between Google and UCSD a couple of years prior. This work was single image portrait relighting, which was from SIGGRAPH 2019. And it's kind of the first that used a neural network for portrait relighting. So, they really introduced this problem space showing that you could solve this with machine learning, but they treated this whole process as a black box, just using a UNet style encoder decoder architecture. So for an input portrait, as you can see here, this approach did a relatively good job at changing the overall diffuse shading of the subject. You can see here, for example, that the color, the intensity, and the directionality of the illumination all appear to be changing for this given input photo. Now, we were inspired by this approach, but we also wanted to be able to add specular highlights, areas of high shine, to increase the photorealism of the rendered results, and to be able to handle input images with strong shadows and specularities. Because as you can see in this example, this approach really worked best when the inputs were relatively flatly and evenly lit. We also wanted to consider relighting in a holistic system with matting rather than using kind of an off-the-shelf segmentation module, because we felt as though the data that our light stage data set kind of afforded us to have we'd be able to train a newer matting technique as well. So towards our goal of background replacement from an arbitrary image, we essentially need three components. We first need a matting module, extracting both the alpha channel and the foreground color from the input image. We next need a relighting module to take the target illumination and the predicted foreground from the matting module as input. And then finally, with these two parts, we can create the final relit portrait using a compositing module. Now, we used machine learning modules for both matting and relighting, and we're going to use just conventional alpha blending for the compositing task. We did do an experiment later on, adding kind of a compositing refinement module using a neural network, but we found minimal improvements here that were kind of insufficient to justify the added compute time. So I'll start by looking first into the two machine learned models for both matting and relighting. We can look quickly at the relighting model, but most of my work was spent on, or we can look very quickly at the matting model, but most of my work was spent on relighting. So I'll do my best to answer questions about matting if people have them, but I know that there's great work on matting and alpha matting coming out of University of Washington. So I'm expecting that there are people on the call who know more about matting than I do. So hopefully I can field the questions adequately, but we can focus on the relighting too. So in the matting module, we're essentially starting with an input image and a trimap, which is obtained from kind of our coarse segmentation. And that segmentation you get using a standard kind of off-the-shelf segmentation network. A trimap has three different values. It's kind of used to tell the matting module which pixels are definitely foreground, which pixels are definitely background, and which ones are we less confident about, basically to ensure that network capacity can be spent dealing with boundary areas that are likely to need the most refinement. The network architecture is set up using one encoder and three decoders, all using UNet type architectures with skip connections. One of the decoders generates a refined trimap, one of them generates the predicted foreground, which will ultimately be relit, and one generates a predicted alpha channel. And we have a variety of losses that are used to train this, but the main idea here is that we're able to do this based on the segmentation network as well as ground truth alpha mats that come from our light stage scans. For the relighting module, we're again going to use several UNet architectures in series, which are designed to assist in relighting by supervising on a meaningful partial intrinsic image decomposition. So if we start with the foreground that was estimated from the matting module, a first network is going to estimate the subject's geometry. So this looks very similar to the portrait light approach. And in fact, the idea of using these surface normals in relighting, we kind of prototyped that with portrait light and then used it to get to more complicated relighting capabilities like you'll see in this work. Then a next network is going to estimate the subject's diffuse albedo. In our case, it's actually a proxy of the diffuse albedo because it's a flat lit portrait of the subject inside the light stage with all the lights turned on, kind of illuminating them evenly from all directions. Recent work in relighting kind of prior to this did show that supervising on these two intrinsic image decomposition components, so surface normals and albedo, could improve relighting results. And so we really weren't the first to do this. And as I said, we did it in portrait light as well. And then we have one final module called Shading Net, which is going to predict finally the relit foreground, taking the albedo and the original foreground as inputs. Now, the lower part of the diagram that I'll show now is kind of where the new contributions for this work really lie, which is how exactly we supply our input lighting environment, kind of our target lighting environment, to the final relighting network. Now, this idea is based on operations called the diffuse and specular convolution. And these are borrowed from real-time graphics from video games many moons ago. What we do is we first pre-filter or pre-convolve the HDR lighting environment with cosine lobes that represent either Lambertian or specular Phong BRDFs. And then by indexing into these pre-filtered panoramas using surface normals, you can create what's called a light map representation, which is an image of the subject's reflectance for a Lambertian or Phong BRDF. Now, in video games, this previously has been implemented as a texture lookup using either the reflection vectors or the surface normals for the Phong specular or the diffuse respectively. But in our case, we're just going to use the built-in TensorFlow imagery sampler, which is differential operation, and it all works fine. So these light maps are then supplied to our shading network that's used for relighting. And the intuition here behind these light maps, because it's like, okay, I've introduced that we're using these light maps, but why do we need them? Why are they better than what's been done before? Essentially, what we're doing is we're providing a way to get the input HDR lighting environment into a format that's pixel aligned or spatially aligned to the input image. And that's going to be important because UNet type architectures like we're using in this work are going to prefer to have such spatially aligned inputs. Previous work in portrait relighting including that single image portrait relighting project that I introduced earlier, simply just supplied the lighting environment, the bottleneck of an encoder decoder architecture. And so those networks had to learn a complex mapping from panorama pixels to portrait pixels, which we're able to avoid entirely, which gives our approach an advantage. And on this slide, I'm showing a few different example pre-filtered lighting environments, as well as the corresponding light maps. And that's for a few different diffuse, which is on the far right, and then finally a few different Phong specular exponents in the rest of the images. Now, to visualize exactly why the light maps are helpful, we can take a look at a sort of visual equation that I will hope, will emphasize this point for you. So for a given portrait A, we know that we can predict the surface normals B. We can just do this just directly with ground truth supervision. And we can predict the albedo, E, again with ground truth supervision. We can then use the diffuse convolved lighting environment, as well as the normals, to create our diffuse light map C, which is the subject's appearance as if they had a perfectly Lambertian or diffuse BRDF. If you then multiply together E and C, you arrive at a diffuse reflectance image of the subject, which has the correct color directionality and overall diffuse shading, but it misses specular highlights as well as more complex shading effects. Now, the specular light maps, as in F, provide the final relighting network with a clue about the ultimate location of specular highlights in the newly relit portrait, as you can see in the Phong shaded portrait in G, which is just adding together image D and image F. So this is basically as good as you could get without using a neural network to do any of the rendering. At this point, the neural network has only been used for predicting the surface normals and for predicting the albedo. We're just using the rendering equations, like very simplified rendering equations for the remainder. And now finally, in H, you can see our neural rendering result, where what we're doing is we're essentially here providing the layers of the Phong reflection model to a neural renderer. And then we're asking the network to learn a more complex shading effect, or more complex shading effects generally, by treating this as a residual learning problem. And so this is a much less difficult learning task compared with just portrait in, relit portrait out of previous approaches, because there's this sort of physics-based supervision happening along the way, which incorporates ideas that we already know from early days of computer graphics. So we can see now how these light maps are used in our network. So in the shading network, which does the bulk of the neural rendering, we supply the albedo, the foreground, and a variety of candidate specular light maps that are computed with different Phong exponents. And these all control the broadness or the extent of the specular highlights. We supply these to a first network that we call SpecularNet. The main idea is that we don't actually know the per pixel specular roughness of the face. We don't know how broad the specular highlights should be. So what we can do is we can learn a spatially varying specular light map, which can pull pixels from each one of these candidate light maps as needed. And then the final specular light map, the albedo and the diffuse light map, are then provided to our final neural rendering network, which is used to produce the relit foreground image. So we look at all the loss terms, there's quite a few of them. We've got all of these that are compared with ground truth. We have L1 loss on the geometry, on the albedo, and on the relit image, finally, because we have ground truth supervision for those. We also use a VGG loss on the albedo and relit images using features that are extracted from VGG network that's been pre-trained for image classification on ImageNet. And then we've got L1 losses on the relit images that are first weighted using the specular reflection map. So this is a bit different. And the rationale behind this is that we can actually train the network to focus specifically on regions of the image that are most likely to contain specular reflections, because these are going to be the most challenging parts for a neural network to be able to synthesize. And we're essentially treating this specular light map as an attention mechanism for the network, or an attention map, trying to get it to focus on synthesizing these really difficult specularities. Because it turns out these networks are better at producing things that are diffuse than specular. We also have adversarial losses for the face region only, for the albedo image as well as the relit image. We found that we really couldn't successfully train a discriminator using our full body images, so we provided just the face crops as input, which was basically just because we needed stability during training. And then for the face relit image discriminator here, we're also supplying a face crop of the specular reflection map, again acting as an attention mechanism for the discriminator, allowing it to focus on regions with specularities in the input, which are going to be the hardest parts to synthesize. So clearly we need a lot of data to train our model here. We also need ground truth images for lots of these different intermediate images like surface normals and albedo. But as we saw with the other project, we're able to do this inside our light stage system. So again, we're going to capture this reflectance basis image, which we also call an OLAT set, which stands for one light at a time. We're going to use the same data set as before, except instead of just using kind of the cameras that we're looking at just faces, here we're actually going to include bodies as well, because we're trying to relight the full system, or the full person, and not just the face. We also are able to capture the albedo using all the lights on from all directions. And then because we have the appearance of each subject lit with point light sources from all directions, we're able to perform a photometric stereo solve to allow us to get the per pixel photometric normals that we can use to supervise the geometry. We also devised a way to kind of generate what we're calling a pseudo ground truth for the alpha mat for each view inside the light stage. And then kind of from all of this raw data that we were capturing here, we're then able to relight the person as before using image-based relighting, and then composite them into our target backgrounds, which in this case came from high resolution panoramas. And so this is all the data that we need to train our matting and relighting models. So we've seen the network architecture, we've seen the data set. I talked about which parts were kind of new to this project and which were things that we borrowed from earlier work or earlier ideas. So at this point, I think we're ready to look at some results from this. So here we've got input portraits on the left. These are the same three that I showed in the very beginning of the talk as kind of the preview. So these three are in the wild images, and we don't have ground truth light stage data for any of them. So we don't have geometry, we don't have their real appearance in different lighting environments. And then we're going to use a few different lighting environments now to relight these three different subjects. And what we're doing here is that we're rotating the lighting environment around the subject. So this is different in lighting environment for each subject, but each shot is a different rotation of the scene. And the big idea here is that a photographer can generate a whole new suite of compelling portraits. So you don't really need to worry too much about what the lighting was in the original scene. And here I wanted to point out a few different features from these images that I mentioned before that we would particularly be looking to achieve. First, the network is able to successfully remove specular highlights. And you can see this here, first for the subject who has a strong highlight on her cheek, kind of above her eyebrow region, as well as in her hair. And the network is also able to do that for this subject as well. And you can see that the subject has a strong specular highlight on the forehead, which is removed in the relit images. Now, to do this, the network has to be able to recover the underlying diffuse skin or hair color of this subject beneath the specular highlights. The network can also successfully add specular highlights, as we can see for this example subject here. And as I mentioned before, this really hasn't been shown in prior portrait relighting work, and so we were particularly happy with this result because it's relatively new. And we think that it's a combination of our loss terms, the in-network lighting representation, just the full system and the quality of the data that are able to produce like these level of results. Now, beyond being able to relight a subject in any lighting environment, we're also interested in relighting subjects under point sources where harsh shadows and specular highlights are bound to be particularly visible. Partially, we're interested in this because it's difficult, but partially we're also interested in adding in point sources into a scene because that's what we did in the earlier portrait light project, where we're kind of adding in these key lights from a single direction. So we wanted to see if this network could also do that as well. So in this example, what we've done is we've generated a lighting environment that approximates an individual light source positioned within the light stage. And here we've shown that our network is able to generate kind of a plausible one light at a time style image. So we're basically able to generate the appearance of a subject lit from an individual lighting direction. And in this GIF, which I hope you'll at least see some of the shots, even if it's not sort of smoothly animated over Zoom, what we're doing is we're showing that we can capture kind of a virtual one light at a time style light stage data set for in the wild portraits using just the neural renderer. And so that we can essentially now pretend that we photographed anybody inside our light stage system in the studio, where we were really only previously able to capture about 70 subjects. So in addition to the core relighting results that I'm showing here, our method is also generating all sorts of potentially useful intermediate outputs, including an extracted original foreground image, an alpha matte, the high quality surface normals, and an albedo. We have a lot of results like these in the paper beyond just for this one individual subject. So, you can take a look there if you want to, but I like this one in particular because I think her hair is just so challenging to matte off the background here. Now I'll show a few different applications of the technique. And so although the method is designed to work on single images, we can apply it for each frame of the video to enable live action compositing. And here is where I know the results may not be quite as smooth because we're looking over Zoom, but hopefully you can at least see per frame images. So we've got albedo, geometry, and this is all operating on a video, even though we only trained this model on individual images. This is a few relighting results now. And then here's another subject. This is our co-author Sergio, albedo, geometry, as well as finally some relighting and compositing results. Finally, we also have a couple of other example applications. One is we're calling portrait lighting transfer. So the idea is that we have the input portraits at the left. We can use the earlier work to estimate the lighting off of these original portraits. And then given the new set of people that we want to relight, we can then relight the top row of subjects to appear as though they were in the lighting environments of the subjects on the left. And again, we already talked about the lighting estimation technique in the earlier part of the talk. We also have an example if you don't have the portrait, you just have an arbitrary background, like in the case with Zoom, say you were to want to upload an arbitrary image and just have the lighting match automatically on your foreground. So this is kind of the first hello world version of that. So using some of our earlier work, we showed that you can take these arbitrary background images, and then you can take portraits that you want to relight, and then you can try to create composites where the lighting on the subjects is matching the background. And although we're kind of on the whole happy with these set of results, as well as the applications, there's a couple of limitations of the current methodology that I want to point out, some of which we're already working to address. And the first thing is that you might have noticed as I've been flipping through the slides that we don't always get to the correct albedo for the clothing regions. It does pretty well on skin and hair regions, but for clothing, we see an example of this particularly in the blue shirt on the right, where the albedo inference network kind of identifies the dark parts of the flannel pattern as being caused by shading rather than by surface reflectance. Additionally, the relighting network isn't really able to produce specular highlights that you might want to see in the eye region of a portrait. We really want to fix this because the eye region is especially critical for compelling portraits. So on that final note, I wanted to thank all of my collaborators at Google, a few now at Netflix, as well as a few others from other affiliations for their help as we completed this project, as well as the Portrait Light project I introduced earlier. And I want to, thank everyone for their attention today, for the opportunity to talk about this work. And I'll probably close out the slides now because I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Chloe. This is a wonderful talk. Let's attempt an applause. Awesome, we did it. We have time for questions, so please ask away.
I've got a question, Chloe, which I guess I could have asked you earlier, but it didn't really occur to me till I watched the whole talk. What about subsurface scattering, which is like a really important effect for skin? It doesn't seem like you model that in any explicit way. Shouldn't that matter? I mean, like, for instance, especially in like really transparent places like the ears and so on, if there's a light coming from behind, they're going to glow. What about those kinds of effects?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously matters a lot for the realism of the portrait. I think what's happening here is that because the data set for creating the ground truth relit portraits is based on this idea of image-based relighting, where we're combining together the appearance of the subject lit from different directions of lighting within the light stage, subsurface scattering effects are actually included within those original data sets. And actually the original image-based relighting paper, which is one of Paul's earlier works from SIGGRAPH 2000, which is, I think it's called Acquiring the Reflectance Field of the Human Face. In that paper, they specifically show that the technique does actually include that part of light transport, right, where you're including subsurface scattering. So the good news for the neural renderer is that the training data includes the subsurface scattering effect. Now, of course, the Phong model that we're using for the light maps doesn't, because it's just like Lambertian and Phong shading. But what we're trying to learn there in the model is the residual between the Phong shaded, like overly simplistic model, and then the full image that would be, the real portrait of the person generated, using image-based relighting. So I think the good news is that subsurface scattering is indeed included in the training data. And so part of what the network has to learn is being able to model that on top of the Phong shaded effects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. But I'm wondering, like, do you have to use such a simplistic Phong model? Like, why not use a more common, since this is kind of a pre-processing step prior to doing the training? Like, it doesn't seem like it would cost you that much to do a more sophisticated lighting model.
Yeah, I think we could potentially provide the network with additional, with light maps that were created using additional rendering techniques. So definitely a good idea. Like, we don't need to use the Phong model as the most simplistic. It was just like, let's see how close we can get with using this basic model. But yes, definitely a good point that we could add in more complex shading methodologies as input to the network.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks.
I guess they'd have to be somewhat differentiable, because you need an operation that involves, sampling into the lighting environment and the geometry. And if we're training the model end to end, then you want the relighting results potentially to be able to affect the surface normals too. So there's some difficulty there because you need a rendering step that's differentiable, but I think it's doable.
Yeah, I think I'm out of my depth, but doesn't Mitsuba 2, like, isn't that like fully differentiable?
Yeah, there's all kinds of differential rendering stuff that's happening now, because people are recognizing that you're going to want to run back propagation using rendering. So lots of work in that space.
Yeah.
Follow-up question, jumping off of that. So you produce these light maps as input into the training model. Okay, first question is, what is the performance of running the relighting neural net? And I guess second question, which depends kind of on the first, is have you thought about just using a renderer for the last step instead of a neural net? You have like normal and albedo data. How hard would it be to get like roughness data?
Yeah, so I think we are essentially like, we're actually sort of somewhat predicting specular roughness as a part of our network. We don't have a way to supervise directly on specular roughness. So we're kind of relying on supervising on the relighting in order to get the roughness out, but there's probably ways that you could get pretty satisfactory specular roughness components from just the light stage data set in a way that we haven't done yet, that I think previous work in face scanning has shown that is somewhat possible to get that out. And I think it's a great idea to be able to use the renderer in that way. I think in our case, we're really trying to see how much can we learn this residual with a neural approach, because a lot of it, we are just using straightforward rendering operations, and we wanted to say, okay, well, let's see how much we can get beyond that. So I guess the question is, will you get high enough quality maps to use in a renderer to get you to the level of detail that you're able to get in our result? I think it would be an interesting comparison, but one that we didn't make, partially because we don't really have all the correct intermediate maps yet, but they definitely could be recorded or derived from light stage data. And then in terms of the compute performance, this was not in any way yet designed for real-time applications. So, the vision of using this in video conferencing, there's going to be significant optimizations and engineering work that has to happen in order for it to get there. And I think the runtime was on the order of maybe a second per portrait. And the portraits that we were sending in were, I think, 768 on the short. So yeah, the width was 768, the height was like 1024 roughly. So it's taking about 1 second to run the full process of relighting. For that resolution. So that gives you a sense of the performance. And that's on like a mobile GPU, like on a phone.
Thank you. That was really enlightening. Also,
yeah, thanks for the question.
Presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
One question to sort of piggyback off of what Tian asked and the answer there. You said that nothing had been run so far on like a real-time performance test. And I'm just curious, since it was all done on mobile GPU, and some of this could be used in a like video conferencing software in the future, what would the potential be for extending this to like a server-side operation where it takes in the raw like video data and then composites it on a server GPU before distributing it back out to everyone else?
I think there's definitely a potentiality there, but I don't know exactly. Like I feel like that's definitely a potential thing that you could do here. So yeah, I don't know what more I could add on it, because obviously Google is interested in this as a video effect filter, right? So there's a question about, is that the approach, or is their approach, is the better approach to try to have it be like a server side thing that's running like you described, or is it better to try to optimize the function, reduce the model size in order to get this running on the client side GPU? And I think there's engineering trade-offs that will have to be made there. And there are people above my pay grade working on that, I think.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry for the kind of vague question.
Well, I gave you kind of a vague answer because I'm not really working in the team anymore, so I can't answer to what extent they decided to go which direction, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about the clothing. So faces make sense, and obviously the algorithm is focusing on faces more than other things. But I was really intrigued by the second part of the talk where you captured full body people. And I was noticing how relighting affects clothing. And so it seems more, what's your thoughts? I mean, I'm assuming that that was not an intention to make it work well for clothing, but I'm curious, like, what you think about, like, because clothing may have like non-rigid effects, more folds, more wrinkles. How does this affect somehow the relighting algorithms, or?
Yeah, so there's some good things about clothing that make it easier, and there's some bad things about clothing that make it harder. The good things about clothing are that clothing generally tends to be diffuse. So we're not running into the same problems with needing to be able to realistically render specular reflections quite as frequently. And so in some cases, it can be easier. The bad news is that there's a relatively constrained space of skin colors and, you know, hair colors and hairstyles, even if you include sort of non-natural hair colors in that mix. There's really, it's somewhat limited. Clothing, just huge amount of variability. And so even the amount of people that we had scanned in our data set, which was about 70 people wearing different costumes, we're able to see already from the results that I presented that the ability to predict the albedo for the clothing doesn't generalize well. And that's just because we didn't see enough examples. And that wasn't the case for faces, where the data set was basically sufficient in size for the majority of the people that we tested in the wild portraits, even with different hairstyles and different skin tones. So much more variability in clothing makes it difficult to capture a data set that will enable model generalizability. But on the other hand, easier because you're generally trying to render diffuse effects. So I don't know if that quite answers the question. I think the main limitation that we saw wasn't in the geometry. We really were able to recover good looking surface normals that you know, included all the right folds and textures and detail for the fabric. It was really the albedo that was proving to be the challenging part. And that's why we highlighted that as a sort of limitation of the technique. And I think ultimately it's because the data set wasn't large enough.
So if you would increase the data set, you think it wouldn't be an issue anymore?
Yeah, but I think there's a question about, is it reasonable? I mean, yes, I think if you had unlimited resources to capture lots and lots of different clothing, like, yes, it wouldn't be an issue. But I also think there's a question of, is it reasonable to try to expand the data set besides, you know, beyond this, because it's already quite a large data set for this kind of problem. So I'm not sure that the technique as it stands is well suited, just because I think trying to estimate the albedo directly may not be the best approach for clothing. But the geometry is fairly accurate already.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, people are thinking, I'll ask another question. Since we are a lot of the some of the people in the audience are students that are developing right now experiences in VR. I wonder if you have any thoughts like about how lighting, it's obvious that lighting will affect any experience, but would it make sense to do some kind of ML-based relighting or in VR? Not sure. Super vague question. Just curious.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess in VR, in like full VR, I'm picturing that the objects in your scene are going to be rendered with consistent lighting. So I think maybe the question is more interesting for mixed reality cases, because in VR, if you can control the lighting of the background and you can control the lighting on like whatever characters or, you know, whatever you're trying to render into the scene, like you should be able to match them to create kind of a more seamless result. I mean, I guess maybe you could play with having different characters lit with different lighting environments for creative effect. But if you're really trying to go for realism, I think you do need the lighting to match across all the things that are in your virtual scene. It starts to become interesting for me when you're in a mixed reality or augmented reality environment, because like, I don't know, I played Pokemon Go pretty extensively and I never really got into using the AR mode very much, partially because of battery life, but, you know, just running the camera continually. But also because, you know, the little Pokemon that was plopped down, like the little Pikachu that was plopped down on the grass, didn't have the right drop shadow from the sun, or didn't have, you know, or directional shadow from the sun. It didn't have, you know, the right shading to indicate that it was, you know, moving out under a bush or behind a tree or, you know, out of the sunlight, for instance. And I feel like it really broke the realism for me. So I'm a big believer that when you're creating mixed reality experiences, that getting the lighting in the virtual content that you're trying to render into the real world scene, whether that's on smartphone AR or for headset, you know, pass-through display type thing. I'm a big believer that you need to match the lighting if you want it to be an immersive experience. And that's easier in VR, definitely harder in AR because you have limited sensing capabilities to be able to measure what the lighting in the real world is, to be able to do that matching. So a lot of my earlier research that I was doing in my PhD was actually trying to match the lighting of the real world with, you know, the lighting of virtual content so that you could have seamless composites. And a lot of it was inspired by, you know, Pokemon Go kind of being a super fun game that I thought had a lot of potential, but never really quite enticed me to be in AR. Other thoughts there, Ira? I don't know.
Related to realism, I keep thinking like how far, I feel like all the relighting algorithms for now are still, they look kind of realistic, like the light, but maybe there's a little like, I don't know, like 0.5% that we're missing still. I wonder what your thoughts there on the realism part actually.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because you're thinking about it specifically for portraits. Are you thinking about it for like generally being able to render content into videos?
I guess both.
Yeah, on the portrait side, you know, I think having more complex models, you know, used as input to this neural renderer could, which, you know, David asked the question about earlier, that could maybe get us the more of the way there, because then you're asking the neural network to do less of the lift. I think, to your point, Ira, like if we don't kind of increase the realism to that, you know, I don't even know that we're like 99% of the way there. I'd say we're maybe like 80% of the way there. If we don't get that remaining 20%, like does this sort of still stay within the realm of a fun gimmick that you could use on a Zoom call, but doesn't have real world applicability yet? Besides that, I think maybe. So potentials for improving it would be, I guess, just trying to figure out how to infuse more of our understanding of physics into the process so that we can have more of it look closer to rendering and less of it look like black box machine learning. Just because we know already in computer graphics that we're able to cross the uncanny valley with renderings, right? We have virtual humans that look indistinguishable from reality. So that makes me feel like if we continue to apply kind of the classical techniques in the more mature field of rendering to this problem space, that we'll have some fruitful results. And in terms of the lighting estimation from an arbitrary scene, in some ways, I think it's a more difficult problem. And I don't even think we're 80% of the way there on that. There have been several papers for trying to do like unconstrained lighting estimation, ultimately to be able to render you know, content realistically into existing footage, and including some of my own work in that space, because I mentioned I was working in that before. I think we have a long way to go there. It's such a difficult problem because when let's say you have a cell phone image and you're trying to figure out what the lighting is in the scene, that your cell phone pointing in front of you is only seeing about 7% of lighting directions in the scene. So if you're looking at your cell phone video, it's only 7% of the 360 environment roughly that you're looking at with the field of view of a phone. And so just trying to, you know, trying to outpaint the rest of that is a very challenging problem. And I think there's two approaches. One of them is possibly like incorporating more sensors into whatever your AR devices. So whether that includes cameras that are facing in additional directions, that's going to like fill in some of that missing information. And I think there's also work to be done in figuring out, is it really the right idea to insist that we measure the full 360 lighting environment like you would want to have for doing visual effects? Is that really the best thing that you need in order to get to realistic rendering? I think from the visual effects world, we believe that really measuring and capturing lighting in the real world is going to give you the optimal composite, but there may be like new shortcuts or ways of thinking about it that mean that you're getting a great looking composite, even if you don't have perfect 100% representative lighting. And we're sort of like, if we're ultimately saying we want to measure lighting so we have a good composite, there's a question of why aren't we just measuring the quality of our composite, right? So maybe lighting doesn't need to be the intermediate there.
I have one other question. I'm very curious, does the model take into account anything regarding like the alignment of the original image? So for instance, if the person is holding the camera slightly askew, does the model try to account for that when doing the initial calculations and like assessing things beyond just the normals and the albedo and that sort of thing? Like, how does it deal with that when doing the rest of the compositing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question too. We eventually found that by basically incorporating translations and slight rotations into the training data for the data set that we're able to negate any of those kinds of effects. But if we only train with, surface normals that are directly computed for a person that's like, front and center in the portrait, kind of in the optimal portrait configuration, then there will be an issue with the normals that are predicted near the edge of the frame. So we're assuming that, we're assuming the camera is, I guess, infinitely far away. So it's, I guess, implicitly an orthographic projection. We're not doing any perspective stuff there, which you might want to do near the edges of the frame, which I think is what your question was getting at. So I think we haven't explicitly stated it, but from thinking about it, the way that we did the data augmentation, I think we're implicitly imposing an orthographic projection on the scene.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Last call for questions. And if not, let us thank Chloe again. Thank you, Chloe, for coming. Hopefully it was a nice experience for you as well. And yeah, let's keep in touch, and please connect with Chloe if you're interested in any of that work.
Yeah, and also, again, the plug for internships and full-time positions. You can contact me if you're interested in figuring out more. I didn't really talk at all about the work that we're doing at Netflix today, but happy to have introductory calls with people if they're interested in hearing about what we're doing there. It's just because the team is so new, we don't have kind of fully fleshed out research products yet. So, but we do have lots of things that we're working on, and we're excited about them. So reach out if you're interested. And thank you again for the invite and for being such a enthusiastic audience, and really impressed with the number of people that came. So thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.